Have you ever looked back on old pictures of yourself? You can see how you've grown and changed over the years. The same could be said before photography even existed. If you lived in that time, you probably knew the names of important people like presidents or congressmen, but how did you know what they looked like if you didn't live near them or know them personally? Portraits and engravings. This is all well and good, but how does this pertain to James Monroe? James Monroe was a prolific figure in American history who accomplished a lot in his lifetime, from being a veteran of the Revolutionary War, to Minister of France and Great Britain, to being President of the United States, to declaring the Monroe Doctrine. But do you know what he looked like?
There are more than a dozen different depictions of James Monroe in different mediums: portraiture, engravings of portraits, silhouettes, busts, statues, and piece medals. Some of these depictions were made by very well-known artists in Monroe's day, such as Charles Bird King, Charles Willson Peale, Rembrandt Peale, John Vanderlyn, Felix Sharples, and Gilbert Stuart, along with various artists even well after his death. Okay, so we know what he looks like. Big deal. We know what other presidents look like too. Just look at Thomas Jefferson or George Washington. While this is true, in the past, a lot of people didn't know what major public figures looked like unless they saw them in person. They didn't have instant access to images like we do now. You may have been able to see one if you were invited into a household like the Madisons, who had a portrait of Monroe, but that was not the case for most people. The depictions of Monroe, discussed in this video, range from when he was minister to France or before, if you include John Trumbull's paintings of the Battle of Trenton and Washington crossing the Delaware, to after his death in 1831. One interesting thing about the depictions of James Monroe is that he was not just a static character or caricature throughout every representation, though there are certainly things that help point out that it is indeed him. One of the earliest images of James Monroe is from 1796 during his time as minister to France. He and his family embraced French culture and were well known for it, leading them to commission portraits from lesser-known Swiss artists working in France by the name of Louis Satin. Due to this being well before some of the later portraits, there are some discrepancies in his likeness, but in context that is to be expected. Not to mention he was only 38 at the time, though he does look a good deal younger. Like a lot of the representations of Monroe, there is very little record of his opinion on his appearance in portraits. However, there is a record of his fondness for the miniature of his wife by Sen. Miniatures like this were small portraits meant for private use, kind of like a wallet photo today, except hand-painted. Like some of the other images of Monroe, this miniature was passed down through the family. All of depictions of James Monroe are created around when he was inaugurated as the 5th president, March 4th, 1817. Remember how most people had no idea what he looked like? Well, this was a transitional period with early American prints and their appearance in newspapers. Before, there were very few prints, especially recognizable people, circulating in the public sphere unless it was perhaps George Washington. But with the presidency of James Monroe, paintings were commissioned to be made into prints to be circulated. One example of this is Charles Bird King's portrait, which was commissioned by William Morgan in honor of Monroe's 1817 inauguration. New technology was developing, and so the price of making prints wasn't as expensive as it was before, which meant that as images were circulated through newspapers, more people were able to see what Monroe looked like. There is actually an anecdote featured in two separate newspapers in 1817. One is from the Newburyport Herald, August 6, 1817, and one from Albany, New York Argus, August 22, 1817. That shows the result of that distribution. Whether this interaction happened or not, it exemplifies the sentiment. A few days after the arrival of Mr. Monroe in Boston, he went out one morning in his carriage to sit for his portrait to Mr. Stuart. Not knowing his dwelling, he stopped a countryman seated on his cart and inquired for Mr. Stuart's house. The countryman looked steadfastly at him. "It is the president, I vow," he said to himself, and instinctively taking off his hat, he gave 3 loud and hearty cheers, and drove off, leaving the president unanswered and astonished. During his last full year of his presidency, 1824 to 1825, there was a painting by Rembrandt Peale, son of Charles Willson Peale, who also painted James Monroe years before. This painting actually looks quite similar to the Charles Bird King portrait, which Goodman and Pickett engraving is based on. However, there are differences. Peale's representation is more focused on Monroe as the subject, showing him as an embodiment of the country, with the capital sitting next to him, even while in the background. It is not known if he actually sat for his portrait or if Peale, who was close with King, based on his work since it was made some years later. Either way, the painting exemplifies one of the consistencies between most depictions of James Monroe, such as his facial features and the way he always wore quite antiquated dress, for which he is known to be called the last of the cocked hats. Not even death stopped the depictions of James Monroe, who died on July 4th, 1831. There were a few works of art commemorating him, but none showed his likeness by himself, except the death mask made by John Henry Isaac Brower before Monroe was interred in New York. James Monroe was one of the few famous figures from whom he was not able to get a life mask, so he made a death mask instead. This mask shows what he looked like at 73 years old. You can still see the distinct features in his face, the wrinkles and all. It is possibly one of the most accurate depictions due to it being literally molded on his face. It's like putting your hand in wet cement, or in this case, plaster. Cool. More people can see what he looked like, but why do we need to see him in the first place? James Monroe was a symbol of hope for a better future in the United States through national unity, especially during his presidency, which was at the start called the Era of Good Feelings. Images have power just as a symbol can. Put them together and it can influence how people act and think about certain topics. James Monroe continued to be an influential figure even after his death, and so the depictions of him were still in demand, especially in the 1850s and 60s, when there was a heightening interest in Virginia's history and heroes. Even into the early 20th century and beyond, representations of him continued to be made. Just take the bas-relief signing of the Louisiana Purchase Treaty by Carl Bitters, 1903-1904, for example. It was a model for the larger sculpture created for the St. Louis World's Fair, celebrating the Louisiana Purchase of 1803. The influence of James Monroe, even 100 years later, persisted. It is an interesting representation due to the fact that it is in sculptural form, of which there were not many before this was made. So, not only do these different images of James Monroe show us what the 5th President of the United States looked like, but they also gave so much more information about Monroe himself and what the country was like during the time they were made.